Miss Marple solves the Mysterious Wyvern Hall Case. Asterisk Chapter 1. The Invitation to Willoughby Vale. The train rattled through the patchwork of English countryside, its rhythm a soothing counterpoint to the crisp October air seeping through the windows. Edges. Miss Jane Marple, seated by the glass, adjusted her shawl and tucked her knitting bag closer. Her nimble fingers paused on the soft wool, her eyes tracing the rolling hills dotted with sheep and the occasional stone wall. She was bound for Willoughby Vale, a village she'd not visited in years, at the behest of her dear friend Lady Beatrice. Langley. Beatrice's letter, penned in her elegant yet hurried hand, had arrived in St. Mary Mead a week prior, its tone laced with an unease that piqued Miss Marple's curiosity. Trouble brews at Wyvern Hall, Beatrice had written, and I should value your quiet wisdom, Jane. Such an invitation, Miss Marple knew, was rarely about mere companionship. As the train slowed, the platform of Willoughby Vale came into view, a modest affair framed by ivy-clad walls and a ticket booth manned by a ruddy-faced porter. Miss Marple gathered her things, her small suitcase light but sufficient, and stepped onto the platform, where the air carried the scent of damp leaves and wood smoke. The village unfolded before her. Cobblestone lanes wound past thatched cottages, their gardens ablaze with late chrysanthemums, while the spire of St. Cuthbert's Church pierced the skyline. Dominating the hill above was Wyvern Hall, its Elizabethan facade of weathered stone and mullioned windows both grand and forbidding. Miss Marple tilted her head, noting the hall's air of secrets, much like the old manor in St. Mary Mead, where a certain widow's disappearance had unraveled a scandal. A carriage awaited, sent by Beatrice, its driver a stooped man named Mr. Gibbs, who doubled as Wyvern Hall's butler. His lined face offered a polite nod, but his eyes darted nervously toward the hall. Lady Beatrice is eager to see you, miss, he said, loading her case. It's been a trying time. Miss Marple smiled, her expression mild, but her mind alert. Gibbs's reticence reminded her of a St. Mary Mead gardener who'd known more about a theft than he'd let on. She settled into the carriage, the clip-clop of hooves on stone lulling her as they ascended the hill. Wyvern Hall's gates loomed, iron wrought with a Langley crest, a wyvern coiled around a sword. The drive wound through oaks, their leaves, a riot of amber and crimson, and past a fountain where water trickled over a mossy nymph. Beatrice awaited at the entrance, her silver hair pinned neatly, her navy dress elegant but practical. Jane, you're a balm to my nerves, she said, embracing her friend. Her smile was warm, but her eyes betrayed strain, like those of a vicar's wife Miss Marple once knew, hiding a family's shame. Over tea in the drawing room, its walls adorned with portraits of stern Langleys, Beatrice explained. Since her husband's death, her brother-in-law, Sir Reginald Langley, had taken charge of Wyvern Hall, a retired colonel. Reginald was brusque, divisive, and intent on selling the estate, a plan Beatrice and others opposed. He's gathered the family tonight, Beatrice said, stirring her tea. To discuss the future, he claims, but it feels like a battle. She listed the guests: Reginald's son, Arthur, a bookish scholar with a nervous air; Clara, Reginald's widowed niece, sharp-tongued and protective of her son, Lionel, a restless artist; and Dr. Hugh Vernon, the family physician whose frequent visits puzzled Beatrice. Miss Marple listened, her knitting needles clicking softly, each name slotting into her mental ledger. Families, she knew, were like village fates, cheerful on the surface but rife with undercurrents. Beatrice led her to a guest room overlooking the gardens, where roses clung stubbornly to their blooms. Miss Marple unpacked, placing her knitting on the bureau and noting the room's details. A creaking floorboard by the window, a faint lavender scent in the air, and a view of the hall's west wing, where Reginald's study lay. She dressed. For dinner, choosing a simple black dress and her mother's brooch, its modest pearl a quiet rebuke to ostentation. Descending the oak staircase, she entered the dining room, its long table set with silver and crystal, the chandelier casting a warm glow over damask walls. The family was assembled, their voices hushed as Beatrice introduced her. Reginald, at the table's head, was a broad man with a clipped mustache and a voice like gravel. "Miss Marple, is it? Beatrice speaks highly of you," he said, his eyes assessing. Arthur, to his right, fidgeted with his napkin, his spectacles slipping down his nose. Clara, opposite, wore a silk gown, her dark hair swept up, her smile polite but cool. Lionel, beside her, sketched idly on a napkin, his dark eyes restless. Dr. Vernon, a lean man with a practiced charm, nodded courteously. Miss Marple took her seat, her gaze flitting from face to face, noting Clara's lavender perfume and Arthur's avoidance of his father's stare. Dinner began with consomme. The conversation stilted. Reginald dominated, declaring his intent to sell Wyvern Hall to a developer. "It's a relic, draining our coffers," he said, slicing his beef. Beatrice protested, citing the hall's history, while Clara argued for modernization, her tone sharp. Arthur murmured about the hall's archives, earning a scoff from Lionel. "Books won't pay the bills, cousin," he said, his pencil scratching. Dr. Vernon steered the talk to neutral ground, mentioning the village's harvest festival, but tension simmered. Miss Marple sipped her wine, recalling a St. Mary mead. Dinner, where a similar clash had preceded a theft dot as dessert poached pears and claret, was served. Reginald grew belligerent, accusing Arthur of idleness. "You'll inherit nothing if you don't shape up," he snapped. Arthur flushed Clara, smirked, and Lionel tossed his napkin down, excusing himself. Miss Marple noted the dynamics, her needles idle in her lap. She asked Reginald about the hall's legends, prompting a gruff tale of a hidden passage used by priests in Elizabethan times. "Nonsense, of course," he said, but Beatrice's eyes flickered with interest. The meal ended, and Reginald announced he retired to his study to review papers. "No disturbances," he barked, striding out. The others dispersed, Beatrice to the drawing room, Arthur to the library, Clara and Lionel to their rooms, Dr. Vernon to his carriage. Miss Marple lingered with Beatrice, discussing village life, but her mind was on Reginald's study. She'd glimpsed its heavy door and single window during a tour, its isolation notable. At 11, as they sipped cocoa, a scream shattered the quiet Clara's voice from the west wing. Beatrice gasped, and Miss Marple set her cup down, her calm unshaken. They hurried toward the sound, joined by Arthur and Gibbs, who fumbled with keys. The study door was locked, the key inside, as Gibbs confirmed after forcing it open. Reginald lay slumped at his desk, a glass of brandy spilled, his face contorted. Dr. Vernon, summoned from his nearby home, pronounced him dead, suspecting poison. The room was sealed, the window latched, the hearth cold, a will open on the desk naming Arthur heir. Miss Marple stepped forward, her eyes scanning the scene, the glass, the papers, a faint lavender scent, a smudged footprint by the hearth. "Curious," she murmured, her voice soft but firm. As the constable was called, she sat, her knitting resumed, her mind already threading the clues. Wyvern Hall, like St. Mary Mead, hid its truths in plain sight. Chapter 2. The Locked Study. The morning after Sir Reginald Langley's death dawned gray over Willoughby Vale, with mist curling around Wyvern Hall's gables like a shroud. Miss Jane Marple stood at her guest room window, her shawl draped over her shoulders, watching the gardens below where dew clung to the last roses. Her knitting bag rested on the bureau, but her hands were still, her mind turning over the events of the previous night. Reginald's body slumped in his study, the locked door, the spilled brandy, and that faint lavender scent lingering in the air. She had seen death before too often, perhaps, in the quiet corners of St. Mary Mead, but a locked room added a puzzle that stirred her curiosity. People are careless, she murmured to herself, even in murder. Downstairs, the hall was subdued, the usual clatter of breakfast muted. Lady Beatrice Langley, pale but composed, greeted Miss Marple in the morning room, where a fire crackled against the chill. "Jane, I hardly slept," Beatrice confessed, pouring tea with a trembling hand. "Reginald was difficult, but to die like that—" Her voice trailed off, and Miss Marple patted her arm, her touch gentle but her eyes sharp. "We shall make sense of it, my dear," she said, her tone as steady as her knitting needles. Beatrice nodded, mentioning that the village constable, Mr. Dobbs, and Inspector Crane from the county police had arrived at dawn to examine the study that Miss Marple joined them in the west wing, her steps soft on the polished oak floors. The study's heavy doors stood ajar, guarded by a young policeman who nodded as she entered. The room was much as she'd seen it last night, a mahogany desk strewn with papers, a leather armchair, and shelves lined with military histories and ledgers. The single window, its latch secure, overlooked a sheer drop to the moat-like ditch below. A cold hearth dominated one wall, its bricks blackened but intact. On the desk, a crystal brandy glass lay tipped, its contents staining the blotter, and beside it Reginald's will, open to a page naming his son Arthur as sole heir. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on a smudged footprint near the hearth, barely visible in the morning light, and that elusive lavender scent, now fainter but unmistakable. Inspector Crane, a lean man with a methodical air, was dusting the glass for fingerprints. He glanced up, his expression worming at Miss Marple's presence. "Miss Marple, your reputation precedes you," he said, tipping his hat. "St. Mary Mead's sleuth, they say." She smiled modestly, her eyes flitting to the constable, Mr. Dobbs, who was sketching the room's layout. "Merely an observer, Inspector," she replied, but her tone held a quiet authority. She asked about the brandy, and Crane confirmed. Dr. Hugh Vernon's initial finding, cyanide, likely administered in the glass. "A quick death," Crane said, "but how it got there, with the door locked and key inside, is the devil of it." Miss Marple stepped closer to the desk, her fingers brushing the will. "This document," she said, "was it disturbed?" Crane shook his head, explaining that the butler, Mr. Gibbs, had found it open when he broke in after Clara's scream. Miss Marple noted a missing page, hinted at by a torn edge in the will's binding. A codicil, perhaps? She mused aloud, recalling a St. Mary Mead case where a missing amendment had sparked a theft. Crane raised an eyebrow, jotting a note. "We'll search for it," he said, then gestured to the door. "Gibbs swears he unlocked it from the outside." And no one else was in the room. The butler, summoned, stood stiffly in his black coat, his face etched with fatigue. "I heard Miss Clara scream, sir," Gibbs said, addressing Crane. "I fetched the spare key from the hall and opened the door. Sir Reginald was gone." His voice faltered, and Miss Marple studied him, noting his clasped hands and the slight tremor in them. "And the key inside?" she asked gently. Gibbs nodded. "On the desk, miss, plain as day." She thanked him, her mind turning to the mechanics of locks. In St. Mary Mead, a gardener had once rigged a window to appear latched, and she wondered if a similar trick applied here. Crane led her to the window, its iron latch rusted but firm. "No one climbed this," he said, pointing to the drop below. Miss Marple agreed, her gaze shifting to the hearth. "This fireplace," she said, "is it used?" Dobbs, eager to contribute, shook his head. "Sealed years ago, miss, to stop drafts." She knelt, her knees protesting, and peered at the bricks. The footprint, small, with a pointed toe, caught her eye again, and she traced its outline with a finger. "Curious," she said, almost to herself. The dust here is disturbed. Crane crouched beside her, frowning. Could be old, he said, but ordered Dobbs to photograph it. As the police continued their work. Miss Marple wandered the room, her eyes catching details. A silver pen slightly askew, a book on military strategy fallen from its shelf, and a faint scratch on the desk's edge, barely visible. She paused by the brandy decanter, its crystal gleaming, and asked Crane to test it for residue. The glass was poisoned, she said, but was the decanter tampered with? Crane nodded, signaling Dobbs to bag it. Miss Marple's thoughts drifted to Clara, whose lavender perfume matched the room's scent, and Arthur, whose nervous demeanor at dinner suggested more than filial grief. Beatrice joined them, her face drawn. "Jane, the family is in the drawing room," she said. "They're shaken, and Clara's taken to her bed." Miss Marple nodded, suggesting they speak with the others. In the drawing room, Arthur sat by the window, his spectacles fogged, a book unopened in his lap. Lionel, Clara's son, paced, his artist's hands stained with charcoal. Dr. Vernon, who'd returned to assist, stood by the fire, his medical bag at his feet. Miss Marple settled into an armchair, her knitting bag beside her, and listened as Crane questioned them. Arthur spoke first, his voice halting. "Father was in the study all evening," he said. "I was in the library reading." His eyes avoided Crane's, and Miss Marple noted his fidgeting fingers, like those of a St. Mary Mead boy caught pilfering apples. Lionel, more defiant, admitted arguing with Reginald over money, but claimed he'd been sketching in his room. "I didn't go near the study," he said, his jaw tight. Dr. Vernon confirmed he'd left Wyvern Hall after dinner, returning only when summoned. Reginald was healthy, save for his temper, he said, his tone professional but guarded. Miss Marple asked about the brandy. "Did Sir Reginald drink alone?" Gibbs, hovering nearby, answered. "He poured it himself, miss, from the decanter." "No one else touched it?" She nodded, her needles clicking as she began a scarf, the rhythm studying her thoughts. Clara's absence nagged at her. Her scream had raised the alarm, yet her perfume lingered in the study. "Might we see Mrs. Clara?" Miss Marple asked Beatrice, who hesitated. "She's resting, but I'll ask." As Beatrice left, Miss Marple turned to Crane. "The hearth," she said softly. "It's worth another look." He agreed, and they returned to the study, where Dobbs was cataloging papers. Miss Marple tapped the hearth's bricks, her ear attuned to the hollow sounds. "Old houses," she said, "have secrets." In St. Mary Mead, a chimney hid a smuggler's cache. Crane, intrigued, pressed the bricks, but none yielded. Still, Miss Marple's certainty grew. The footprint, the scent, the missing codicil, pointed to someone familiar with the hall's nooks. The morning wore on, and Crane received a report. The brandy glass held cyanide, but the decanter was clean. "So the poison was added directly," Crane said, rubbing his chin. Miss Marple nodded, her mind on Clara's lavender and Lionel's debts. She recalled a St. Mary Mead widow who'd poisoned a rival, her charm masking malice. "People reveal themselves," she said to Crane, "and what they hide." He smiled, recognizing her insight. "We'll keep digging, Miss Marple." Beatrice returned, reporting Clara too distraught to speak. Miss Marple thanked her, her knitting a steady rhythm. As she rose, her eyes caught a glint in the study's rug, a tiny pearl, like one from a necklace. She slipped it into her pocket, unnoticed, and followed Beatrice out, her mind weaving the clues: a locked room, a poisoned glass, a hidden codicil, and a pearl out of place. Wyvern Hall's enigma was deepening, but Miss Marple, with her quiet patience, was already unraveling its threads. Chapter 3. Whispers in the village. The morning mist had lifted by the time Miss Jane Marple stepped out of Wyvern Hall, her sensible shoes tapping softly on the gravel drive. A pale sun filtered through the oaks, casting dappled light on the cobblestone lane that wound down to Willoughby Vale. Her knitting bag swung gently at her side, its contents a comforting weight, though her mind was far from the half-finished scarf within. The locked study, the poisoned brandy, the smudged footprint by the hearth, each detail of Sir Reginald Langley's death tugged at her thoughts like a loose thread. She had solved puzzles before in St. Mary Mead, where village gossip often held the key, and she suspected Willoughby Vale's whispers would prove just as revealing. The village lay nestled in a shallow valley, its thatched cottages and stone walls exuding a timeless charm. Chimneys puffed lazy smoke, and the air carried the scent of baking bread and damp earth. Miss Marple paused at the green, where a weathered statue of St. Cuthbert stood guard, its base ringed with late marigolds. Children chased a hoop nearby, their laughter mingling with the clink of milk bottles on a delivery cart. She smiled, reminded of St. Mary Mead's own green, where a seemingly innocent remark had once unraveled a theft. Villages, she knew, were like tapestries. Every thread, no matter how small, contributed to the pattern. Her first stop was the post office, a squat building with a red-tiled roof and a sign proclaiming Penny's Post and Sundries. Inside, Mrs. Penny, a stout woman with a bun as tight as her opinions, sorted letters behind a counter cluttered with stamps and parcel twine. "Good morning, miss," she said, peering over her spectacles. "Your Lady Beatrice's friend staying at the hall." Her tone was polite but hungry for news, and Miss Marple nodded, her expression mild. "Jane Marple," she introduced herself, asking for a postcard to send to St. Mary Mead. As Mrs. Penny rummaged, she launched into gossip, unprompted but welcome. "Terrible business at Wyvern Hall," Mrs. Penny said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial hush. "Sir Reginald, poisoned, they say. Not that he was loved, mind you. Argued with half the village over that plan to sell the hall." She leaned closer, her eyes gleaming. "Young Lionel, Clara's boy, was always at odds with him, owed him money, I heard, for those fancy paints of his." Miss Marple tilted her head, her fingers brushing the knitting bag. "Money does complicate family ties," she said, her tone inviting more. Mrs. Penny obliged, mentioning Clara's resentment of Arthur, Reginald's son, who stood to inherit everything. "Clara's a proud one," she added, "and that lavender. Son of hers, folks say it's everywhere she goes." Miss Marple thanked her, tucking the postcard away. The lavender scent, matching the study's faint trace, lingered in her mind like a clue half seen. She stepped outside, the bell above the door jingling, and made her way to the tea shop across the green. The willow leaf was a cozy nook, its windows steamed from a kettle's boil, its tables adorned with lace doilies. Elsie, the young waitress, greeted her with a shy smile, her apron dusted with flour. "Tea and a scone, miss?" she asked, and Miss Marple nodded, settling by a window with a view of the church spire dot as Elsie served a pot of Earl Grey. Miss Marple drew her into conversation, her questions gentle but deliberate. "The hall must keep the village talking," she said, buttering her scone. Elsie blushed, glancing around before speaking. "Oh, it does, miss. Sir Reginald was stern like Dr. Vernon was up there often, late at night, with his black bag. Folks wondered if the colonel was ill, but he never said." She hesitated, then added, "Clara and Lionel stayed at the hall a lot, too, though Lionel's always sketching by the river, not minding the cold." Miss Marple sipped her tea, her eyes bright. Dr. Vernon's late visits, like those of a St. Mary Mead apothecary caught in a scandal, suggested more than routine care. The tea shop buzzed with locals, their chatter a low hum. At a nearby table, two women discussed the harvest festival, but their voices dipped when Wyvern Hall was mentioned. Miss Marple caught fragments. "Clara's too clever for her own good, and Arthur's not got the spine to stand up to her." She filed each snippet away, her knitting needles clicking as she pulled her wool from the bag. Gossip, she knew, was like a village stream, muddy at times, but often carrying flecks of gold. In St. Mary Mead, a postmistress's remark had once pointed to a hidden affair, and she sensed Willoughby Vale's whispers held similar truths. Returning to Wyvern Hall, Miss Marple found Lady Beatrice in the conservatory, tending a wilting orchid. The glass walls trapped the scent of earth and blooms, and Beatrice's face softened at her friend's arrival. "Jane, you've been exploring," she said, setting down her trowel. "The village must be abuzz." Miss Marple nodded, sharing Mrs. Penny's and Elsie's remarks, though she softened their edges. Beatrice sighed, her hands twisting a handkerchief. Reginald was difficult, she admitted, but he had plans to revise his will, perhaps for charity. And he was obsessed with a family legend, a hidden passage in the hall from Elizabethan days. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed at the mention of the passage, recalling the study's hearth and its smudged footprint. "Old houses do keep secrets," she said, her tone light but probing. Beatrice nodded, describing Reginald's late night searches, tapping walls, and studying old plans. "He thought it was near the study," she said, "but never found it." Miss Marple asked about Clara and Lionel, and Beatrice hesitated. "Clara's protective of her son," she said, "and Lionel's restless, always sketching or borrowing money. Reginald indulged him, but not without friction." As they spoke, Inspector Crane arrived, his notebook in hand. He'd interviewed the staff, and Miss Marple joined them in the library, where shelves of leather-bound books rose to a vaulted ceiling. Crane reported that Gibbs, the butler, confirmed unlocking the study after Clara's scream, with no one else present. Peter. Housemaid Jenny had seen Clara near the west wing before the scream, her lavender perfume trailing. "Clara claims she was checking on Reginald," Crane said, "but she's vague about the timing." Miss Marple nodded, her needles steady. "And the footprint by the hearth?" she asked. Crane admitted they'd found no match yet, but the photograph was being analyzed. The library's quiet was broken by Arthur's arrival, his spectacles askew, a book on Wyvern Hall's history under his arm. "I've been reading about the passage," he said, his voice tentative. "There's a sketch in the archives from 1600 hinting at a priest a hole." Miss Marple encouraged him to share it, noting his reluctance when Crane asked to see the book. "It's just a theory," Arthur mumbled, retreating. His nervousness, like that of a St. Mary Mead clerk hiding a debt, suggested more than scholarly shyness. Crane excused himself to check on the brandy decanter's analysis, leaving Miss Marple with Beatrice. She asked about Clara's late husband, probing Mrs. Penny's hint about his chemistry work. Beatrice frowned. "He was a pharmacist, I believe, but died years ago." "Clara rarely speaks of him." Miss Marple nodded, her mind on cyanide's accessibility. In St. Mary Mead, a chemist's widow had once used her husband's stores for ill, and she wondered if Clara's past held similar shadows as noon approached. Miss Marple strolled the hall's grounds, her eyes on the study's window, high and unyielding. The moat below was choked with reeds, its surface still. She paused by the stables, where a groom polished tack, and asked if anyone had been out the night of the murder. "No, miss," he said, all quiet. Yet the footprint, the lavender, and the missing codicil gnawed at her. She returned to the hall, joining Beatrice for lunch, where the family gathered, their faces strained at Clara. Recovered from her distress, sat erect, her lavender scent wafting. Lionel sketched in a notebook, his eyes darting to Arthur, who picked at his food. Dr. Vernon, present at Beatrice's request, spoke of the village's shock. Miss Marple watched, her knitting a steady rhythm, noting Clara's sharp glance at Arthur when the will was mentioned. "Reginald was hasty," Clara said, naming only one heir. Arthur flushed and Lionel smirked, the tension palpable as the meal ended. Miss Marple slipped the pearl from her pocket, found in the study's rug, and studied it discreetly. It matched a necklace Clara had worn at dinner, its clasp loose. She tucked it away, her mind weaving connections, the passage, the perfume, the pearl, the codicil. Willoughby Vale's whispers were growing louder, and Miss Marple, with her quiet patience, was listening. Chapter 4. The family's secrets. The afternoon sun slanted through the tall windows of Wyvern Hall's dining room, casting long shadows across the polished mahogany table where the Langley family gathered for lunch. Miss Jane Marple sat near. Lady Beatrice Langley, her knitting bag tucked beside her chair, its contents untouched as her eyes roamed the room. The air was heavy with the scent of roasted lamb and rosemary, but an undercurrent of unease soured the meal. Sir Reginald Langley's death the previous night, poisoned in his locked study, had left the household reeling, and Miss Marple, with her quiet demeanor, was already piecing together the threads of motive and opportunity. She had seen such tensions before in St. Mary Mead, where a family dinner could reveal more than a constable's notebook. Beatrice, her silver hair catching the light, presided with strained grace, her hand smoothing the linen napkin in her lap. To her right sat Arthur Langley, Reginald's son and heir, his spectacles slipping as he poked at his plate, his face pale as the porcelain. Across from him, Clara Langley, Reginald's widowed niece, sat erect, her silk gown a deep emerald. That contrasted with the faint lavender scent wafting from her. Her son Lionel slouched beside her, his artist's fingers drumming on the table, a sketchbook tucked under his arm. Dr. Hugh Vernon, the family physician, completed the group, his lean frame relaxed but his eyes watchful. Miss Marple noted each gesture, each glance, her mind cataloging details like the vicar's wife in St. Mary Mead, who'd betrayed her guilt with a fidgeting hand. The meal began with a cream of asparagus soup, the clink of spoons punctuating the silence. Beatrice attempted to lighten the mood, mentioning the upcoming village fete, but her words fell flat. Clara broke the quiet, her voice sharp as she addressed Arthur. "You must be relieved, Arthur, to have the estate secured," she said, her smile thin. Arthur flushed, his spoon clattering. I hadn't thought of it that way," he stammered. "Father's death is a shock." Lionel snorted, earning a glare from his mother. "Relieved or not, you're the one who benefits," he said, his tone biting. Miss Marple's needles remained still, but her eyes flicked between them, noting the resentment that simmered like a St. Mary Mead feud over a contested inheritance. Beatrice intervened, her voice gentle but firm. "Let's not speak of such things now." She turned to Miss Marple, asking about St. Mary Mead, and Miss Marple obliged, sharing a tale of a village bazaar that had masked a theft. Her story was light, but her gaze lingered on Clara, whose lavender perfume recalled the study's scent, and on Arthur, whose avoidance of Clara's barbs suggested more than grief. Dr. Vernon steered the conversation to Reginald's health, claiming he'd prescribed a sedative for the colonel's nerves. "Nothing stronger," he said, meeting Crane's earlier questions with practiced ease. Miss Marple asked, her tone mild, "And the brandy he drank that night, did you see him pour it?" Vernon shook his head. "I left after dinner, Miss Marple. Reginald was particular about his brandy." The butler, Mr. Gibbs, entered with the main course, his face impassive as he served the lamb. Miss Marple seized the moment to inquire about the brandy's source. "Was the decanter always kept in the study?" she asked. Gibbs nodded, his hand steady. "Sealed and locked in the cabinet, miss. Sir Reginald filled it himself from the cellar." She thanked him, her mind on the cyanide-laced glass. In St. Mary Mead, a poisoned jar of jam had been traced to a kitchen oversight, but Wyvern Hall's decanter seemed too deliberate. She glanced at Lionel, whose restless energy reminded her of a young man in her village, caught pilfering to pay. Dead stopped as the meal progressed. Arthur ventured a comment, his voice hesitant. "I've been researching the hall's history," he said, glancing at Beatrice. "There's mention of a hidden passage tied to the priest's whole legend." "Clara's." Fork paused, her eyes narrowing. "Nonsense, Arthur. You're chasing fairy tales when you should be planning the estate's future." Her tone was dismissive, but Miss Marple caught a flicker of unease in her expression, like that of a St. Mary Mead widow hiding a secret loan. Lionel smirked, sketching idly on his napkin. "Let him dream, Mother. The hall's falling apart anyway." Miss Marple leaned forward, her voice soft. "Legends often hold truth, Mr. Langley. Have you found any old plans?" Arthur brightened, then faltered. Under Clara's gaze. "Just sketches in the library," he mumbled. "I'll show you later." She nodded, her knitting bag a reassuring weight. A hidden passage, if real, could explain the locked study's mystery, much like a concealed attic in St. Mary Mead had hidden a runaway's diary. She resolved to examine the library, her curiosity piqued by Arthur's reticence and Clara's. Quick dismissal. Dr. Vernon, sensing the tension, mentioned the village's harvest festival, his charm smoothing the edges. "The hall's always been central to Willoughby Vale," he said. "Reginald's plan to sell it stirred tempers." Clara seized the topic, her voice rising. He was right to consider it. "This pile of stones is a burden." Arthur's jaw tightened, and Beatrice's hands clenched her napkin. Miss Marple watched, her needles idle, noting how Clara's push for modernization clashed with the other's attachment to tradition. Families, she knew, fractured over less after lunch. Miss Marple joined Beatrice in the drawing room, where a fire crackled against the autumn chill. Beatrice confided that Reginald had spoken of revising his will, possibly favoring a veteran's charity over Arthur alone. He mentioned it days before. "This," she said, her voice catching. Miss Marple nodded, the missing codicil looming in her thoughts. "And Clara knew of this?" she asked. Beatrice hesitated. "She overheard him, I think. She was furious, saying Lionel deserved more." Miss Marple's eyes gleamed, recalling a St. Mary Mead case where a changed will had sparked betrayal. Inspector Crane arrived, his notebook bulging with notes. He'd tested the brandy decanter, finding no cyanide, confirming the poison was in the glass alone. "Someone added it after Reginald poured," he said, his brow furrowed. Miss Marple suggested checking the study's cabinet for tampering, and Crane agreed, dispatching Constable Dobbs to inspect it. She then asked about Clara's scream, which had raised the alarm. Crane frowned. "She says she went to check on Reginald and found him dead, but her story's shaky too many gaps." Miss Marple nodded, the pearls she'd found in the studies. Rug weighing in her pocket. Its match to Clara's necklace was no coincidence. Beatrice excused herself to rest, and Miss Marple wandered to the library, its oak shelves towering under a stained glass skylight. Arthur was there, poring over a leather-bound volume, his fingers tracing a faded map. "Miss Marple?" he said, startled, pushing his spectacles up. She smiled, asking about the passage. He showed her a 17th century sketch, its lines marking a priest's hole near the study's hearth. "Father was obsessed with it," he said, "but Clara thinks it's a waste of time." Miss Marple studied the map, her mind on the hearth's footprint. "Old houses keep their secrets well," she said, her tone encouraging. Arthur nodded, but his eyes darted to the door, as if expecting Clara's disapproval as evening fell. Miss Marple returned to the study with Crane, who'd found no tampering in the cabinet. She examined the hearth again, its bricks unyielding, but the footprint clear, a woman's shoe, pointed and small. The lavender scent, though faint, persisted, and she recalled Clara's necklace, its loose clasp shedding pearls. "We must speak with Mrs. Langley," she said to Crane, her voice firm. He agreed, but Clara, summoned, was tearful, claiming grief kept her abed. Miss Marple watched her retreat, her knitting resumed, its rhythm steadying her thoughts. Dinner was a somber affair, the family silences louder than their words. Lionel sketched moodily, Arthur avoided Clara's gaze, and Dr. Vernon spoke of Reginald's heart, deflecting questions. Miss Marple observed, her mind weaving the clues, the codicil, the passage, the pearl, the perfume. In St. Mary Mead, a widow's charm had hidden malice, and she sensed Clara's composure masked something deeper. As the meal ended, she slipped the pearl from her pocket, its sheen catching the candlelight. Wyvern Hall's secrets were unraveling, and Miss Marple, with her quiet patience, was closing in. Chapter 5. A Clue in the Library. The late afternoon light filtered through the library's stained glass skylight, casting kaleidoscopic patterns across the oak shelves of Wyvern Hall. Miss Jane Marple stood near a towering bookcase, her sensible shoes silent on the Persian rug, her knitting bag slung over her arm like a faithful companion. The air was thick with the scent of old leather and wax polish, a quiet sanctuary amid the turmoil of Sir Reginald Langley's murder. The locked study, the cyanide-laced brandy, the smudged footprint by the hearth, these fragments of the puzzle, occupied her thoughts, each a thread in a tapestry she was determined to unravel. In St. Mary Mead, a library's dusty tomes had once revealed a blackmailer's secret, and Miss Marple suspected Wyvern Hall's shelves held similar truths. She had come to the library seeking Arthur Langley, Reginald's son, who'd hinted at a hidden passage tied to the hall's history. The room was vast, its walls lined with books from floor to ceiling, interrupted only by a marble fireplace and a bank of windows overlooking the moat. A heavy oak table stood at the center, strewn with maps and manuscripts, where Arthur hunched, his spectacles glinting as he traced a faded sketch. His tweed jacket hung loosely on his slight frame, and his fingers trembled as he turned a page, betraying a nervousness Miss Marple had seen in a St. Mary Mead clerk caught hiding debts. "Mr. Langley," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "I believe you mentioned a priest's hole?" Arthur started, pushing his spectacles up his nose. "Miss Marple." "Yes, I was just looking at it." He gestured to a leather-bound volume, its pages yellowed but intact. "This is a history of Wyvern Hall from 1600. There's a sketch here, see?" He slid the book toward her, revealing a pen and ink drawing of the hall's west wing, with a cryptic line marking a priest's hole near the study. The sketch was crude, its lines smudged, but Miss Marple's eyes gleamed as she studied it. "Fascinating," she said, her tone encouraging. "And your father believed this passage existed?" Arthur nodded, his voice low. He was obsessed with it, tapping walls, searching late at night. Clara thought it nonsense, but I wonder... Miss Marple tilted her head, her mind on the study's hearth, where a smudged footprint and a faint lavender scent had caught her attention. "Old houses do keep secrets," she said, recalling a St. Mary Mead manor where a hidden panel had concealed a stolen locket. "Might we search for it?" Arthur hesitated, glancing at the door as if expecting Clara's sharp rebuke. "I suppose, but Clara disapproves. She says it distracts from settling the estate." His reluctance, like that of a village boy avoiding a chore, suggested more than familial tension. Miss Marple smiled, her expression mild but probing. "A brief look can do no harm," she said, and Arthur, reassured, agreed to show her the study later. As they spoke, Inspector Crane entered, his notebook tucked under his arm, his face etched with the strain of the investigation. "Miss Marple, Mr. Langley," he greeted, nodding. "Any progress on that passage?" Arthur flushed, closing the book. "Just theories, Inspector," he said, his voice faltering. Crane turned to Miss Marple reporting that the brandy decanter was clean, that the glass held cyanide residue, confirming the poison was added directly. Someone was in that room, he said, rubbing his chin. But the locked door and key inside, it's a devil of a puzzle. Miss Marple nodded, her mind on the footprint. Have you tested the hearth for prints? She asked. Crane admitted. They'd found none, but the photograph of the smudge was under analysis. She wandered the shelves, her fingers brushing the spines, her eyes scanning for anomalies. Near a high shelf, she spotted a book out of place, a slim volume on toxicology, its cover worn, wedged among histories. She reached for it, her knees protesting as she stretched, and opened it to find pages dog-eared at a chapter on cyanide. The book's position, too high for casual reading, suggested deliberate concealment, much like a St. Mary Mead ledger hidden in a vicar's study. Inspector, she called softly, this may be of interest. Crane joined her, his brow furrowing as he examined the book. Odd place for it, he said, bagging it for evidence. Could be nothing, but I'll have it checked for prints. Arthur watched, his hands twisting. That's Father's book, he said, his voice tight. He read widely, even poisons. His unease, like that of a St. Mary Mead youth caught near a crime, piqued Miss Marple's interest. She asked, her tone light, did he discuss such topics with anyone? Arthur shook his head too quickly. Not that I recall. She nodded, filing the lie away, her knitting bag a steady weight at her side. The library door creaked, and Lady Beatrice entered, her silver hair pinned neatly, her face drawn. Jane, Arthur, I thought I'd find you here, she said, her voice warm but tired. The family's restless, and Clara's pressing for decisions about the estate. Miss Marple noted the strain in her friend's eyes, reminiscent of a St. Mary Maid widow burdened by secrets. They must be patient, she said, patting Beatrice's arm. The truth takes time. Beatrice nodded, mentioning that Dr. Vernon had returned, claiming Reginald's sedative was standard, not cyanide. He's cooperative, she said, but Claire is so volatile. Miss Marple suggested they join the others, and they moved to the drawing room where the family had gathered. Clara sat by the fire, her lavender perfume wafting, her emerald gown catching the light. Lionel sprawled on a sofa, sketching moodily, while Dr. Vernon stood by a window, his medical bag at his feet. The air was thick with tension, and Miss Marple settled into an armchair, her knitting bag beside her, her needles clicking as she began a row. Crane, who'd followed, questioned Lionel about his whereabouts the night of the murder. I was in my room, sketching, Lionel said, his tone defiant. Ask Mother she saw me. Clara nodded, her eyes sharp. He was there, Inspector. Miss Marple watched, noting Clara's quick defense, like that of a St. Mary Mead mother shielding. A wayward son, she asked, her voice soft. And you, Mrs. Langley, were near the study before your scream? Clara's smile tightened. I went to check on Reginald, she said, and found him. Gone. Her voice caught, but her eyes were dry, and Miss Marple recalled the pearl in her pocket, matching Clara's necklace. A terrible shock, she said, her tone sympathetic but probing. Clara nodded, her lavender scent strong, and Miss Marple's needles paused, her mind on the study's matching trace. Dinner was announced, and the family moved to the dining room where candlelight flickered on silver and crystal, the meal roast. Pheasant and glazed carrots was served by Gibbs, his face impassive but his hands steady. Conversation was stilted, with Beatrice attempting to lighten the mood by mentioning the village's harvest festival. Clara seized the opportunity, her voice sharp. The hall's a burden, she said, addressing Arthur. Sell it and we're free. Arthur's fork clattered, his face paling. It's our history, he said, his voice barely audible. Lionel laughed, his sketchbook open. History won't pay my debts, cousin. Miss Marple observed her. Knitting resumed, noting Clara's insistence and Arthur's retreat. She asked, her tone casual, did Sir Reginald share his plans for the will? Clara's eyes narrowed, but Beatrice answered. He spoke of a charity bequest for veterans. Clara overheard and wasn't pleased. Clara's jaw tightened, and Miss Marple's needles clicked, her mind on the missing codicil. In St. Mary Mead, a changed will had sparked a theft, and she sensed a similar motive here. As dessert apple tart with cream was served. Lionel accused Arthur of hiding the codicil to secure his inheritance. You'd do anything to keep the hall, he said, his voice bitter. Arthur flushed, his spectacles fogging. That's unfair, he said, but his voice lacked conviction. Clara defended her son, her lavender scent wafting as she leaned forward. Lionel's right to question, she said. Reginald was hasty. Miss Marple watched, her needles steady, recalling a St. Mary Mead dinner where accusations had masked guilt. The meal ended, and Miss Marple lingered with Beatrice, discussing the day's findings. She mentioned the toxicology book, the priest's whole sketch, and Clara's perfume, her voice low. Beatrice frowned, her hands twisting a handkerchief. Clara's always worn lavender, she said, but she's so protective of Lionel. Miss Marple nodded, the pearl in her pocket a silent clue. People reveal themselves, she said, and what they guard. Beatrice sighed, and Miss Marple patted her arm, her mind weaving the clues. The book, the sketch, the perfume, the pearl. Wyvern Hall's library had yielded a clue, and Miss Marple, with her quiet patience, was closer to the truth. Chapter 6. The Hidden Passage. Evening shadows deepened in Wyvern Hall's west wing, cloaking Sir Reginald Langway's study in a hush broken only by the faint creak of floorboards. Miss Jane Marple stood by the hearth, her knitting bag slung over her arm, its familiar weight grounding her as she surveyed the scene of the crime. The locked door, the cyanide-laced brandy, the smudged footprint in the ash. These fragments of the puzzle stirred her curiosity, each a clue to a truth. Hidden within the hall's ancient walls, and St. Mary Mead, a concealed panel in a vicar's study, had once revealed a blackmailer's letters, and Miss Marple sensed Wyvern Hall's secrets were equally tangible, waiting to be uncovered. Inspector Crane had granted her and Arthur Langley, Reginald's son, permission to explore the study, and Arthur stood by the desk, his spectacles glinting in the lamplight, his hands fidgeting like a St. Mary Mead boy caught near a misdeed. The air held a faint lavender scent, a persistent echo of Clara Langley's perfume, and Miss Marple's eyes lingered on the hearth's footprint, a small pointed shoe, its outline clear. Mr. Langley, she said, her voice gentle but deliberate. Your library sketch placed the priest's hole here, by the fireplace? Arthur nodded, his voice hesitant. Yes, the 1600 plan marked it. Father searched for it obsessively, though Clara called it a fool's errand. Miss Marple knelt, her knees protesting, and tapped the hearth's bricks, her ear attuned to subtle shifts in sound. Old houses, she mused, are like village gossips. They guard their tailies until pressed. Her fingers brushed a brick, slightly misaligned, its edges smoother than its neighbors, as if worn by frequent touch. She pressed it firmly, and a soft click resonated, followed by a low groan as a section of the hearth swung inward, revealing a narrow passage. Dust swirled in the lamplight, and Arthur gasped, stepping back, his face a mix of awe and trepidation, like a St. Mary Mead lad stumbling on a smuggler's hoard. Crane, alerted by a constable, arrived swiftly, his notebook at the ready. Miss Marple, you've outdone yourself, he said, his tone blending admiration with exasperation. He shone a torch into the passage, its stone walls damp and cobwebbed, leading to a cramped chamber barely wide enough for two. A second tunnel sloped downward, its end lost in shadow. Miss Marple peered inside. noting fresh disturbances in the dust footprints matching the hearth's smudge, suggesting recent use. Curious, she murmured, her mind racing to Clara's lavender scent and the pearl from her necklace. Found in the study's rug, now tucked in her pocket, Arthur, emboldened, stepped into the chamber, his torch catching a glint on the floor, a torn scrap of paper, its edge ragged, with codicil scrawled in Reginald's precise hand. Crane bagged it, his brow furrowing. "This could be from the missing will amendment," he said, ordering Constable Dobbs to dust for fingerprints. Miss Marple nodded, recalling a St. Mary Mead case where a torn note had betrayed a jilted lover's motive. "The passage solves the locked room," she said, "but the poison remains a riddle." She asked Arthur if anyone else knew of the priest's hole. He shook his head, his eyes darting to the door. Only father, and he kept it secret. Clara mocked his searches. They followed the tunnel, its air chill and musty, navigating its twists until they reached a concealed exit near the stables, masked by a stone panel overgrown with ivy. The hinges were rusted but functional, and Miss Marple noted the absence of footprints outside, suggesting a cautious intruder. "Someone who knew the hall's layout," she said to Crane, "and its hidden ways." He agreed, sealing the exit. For further inspection, back in the study, she examined the hearth's mechanism, its lever cunningly disguised. "A clever design," she said, "like a trapdoor in a St. Mary Mead barn that hid stolen silver." Crane summoned Mr. Gibbs, the butler, who stood stiffly, his black coat immaculate but his face pale. "I knew nothing of this passage, sir," he said, his voice steady but his hands clasped tightly, betraying unease akin to a St. Mary Mead. "Gardner caught near a theft, and no one spoke of it?" Miss Marple asked, her tone mild. Gibbs shook his head, but his eyes flickered, and she stored the reaction in her mental ledger. She requested Crane search the chamber for further clues, and Dabbs returned with a single green silk thread. Matching Clara's gown from the night of the murder, dinner was a tense affair, the dining room's candlelight casting long shadows. Across the silver and crystal, Beatrice presided, her face drawn, while Clara sat composed, her lavender perfume wafting as she cut her pheasant. Lionel, her son, sketched restlessly, his eyes darting to Arthur, who avoided his cousin's gaze. His spectacles fogging, Dr. Vernon, invited by Beatrice, spoke of the village's shock, his charm a buffer against the tension. Miss Marple, her knitting bag beside her, mentioned the passage's discovery, watching the family closely. Clara's smile tightened, her fork pausing midair. "A childish legend," she said, her voice dismissive. "Hardly relevant." Lionel smirked, but Arthur paled, mumbling, "It's real." "Father was right," Miss Marple pressed gently, her tone casual. "Did Sir Reginald share his searches with anyone?" Beatrice hesitated, then admitted he'd discussed it with Clara, who'd scoffed. Clara's eyes flashed. "He was chasing ghosts," so she said, her voice sharp. Miss Marple nodded, her needles clicking, recalling a St. Mary Mead widow whose scorn had masked a complicity in a theft. She palmed the pearl in her pocket, noting Clara's necklace, another bead missing from its clasp, and her mind connected the green thread to the passage's dust. After dinner, Miss Marple joined Beatrice in the drawing room, where a fire crackled, its warmth a contrast to the hall's chill. Beatrice confided that Clara had clashed with Reginald over Lionel's debts, fearing the codicil would disinherit them. "She's fiercely protective," Beatrice said, her hands twisting a handkerchief, her eyes weary. Miss Marple nodded, the green thread and lavender scent weaving into her thoughts. "Love can blind us," she said, her voice soft, recalling a St. Mary Mead mother whose devotion had led to deception. Crane arrived, reporting no fingerprints on the codicil scrap, but the green thread confirmed a match to Clara's gown. "It's circumstantial," he said, but it narrows the field. Miss Marple suggested questioning Clara about her movements, though her claimed grief had kept her elusive. As Beatrice retired, Miss Marple lingered, her knitting a steady rhythm, her mind on the passage's footprints and the silk thread. Wyvern. Hall's walls had yielded a secret, and Miss Marple, with her quiet patience, was closer to the truth. Chapter 7. The doctor's alibi. The morning mist wreathed Wyvern Hall's gardens, softening the outlines of the rosebeds as Miss Jane Marple walked the gravel paths, her knitting bag a familiar weight. The hidden passage's discovery had cracked. The locked room mystery, but the cyanide source remained elusive, a riddle that tugged at her like a dropped stitch. Dr. Hugh Vernon, the family physician, had hovered on the investigation's edges, his late-night visits to Reginald noted. By the village, his calm demeanor a puzzle in itself. In St. Mary Mead, a doctor's bag had once concealed forged prescriptions, and Miss Marple wondered what Vernon's black bag might hide. She returned to the hall, joining Lady Beatrice in the morning room, where sunlight pierced the lace curtains, casting delicate shadows. Beatrice, stirring her tea, mentioned Vernon's arrival, summoned by Inspector Crane for further questioning. "He's been cooperative," she said, her voice tinged with doubt, "but the village gossips about his late visits." Miss Marple nodded, her needles clicking as she began a scarf, her mind on Elsie's teacup remark about Vernon's nocturnal calls. "Patterns betray us," she said, her tone light but probing, recalling a St. Mary Mead apothecary whose routines had unmasked a fraud. Crane met them in the library, its shelves a fortress of leather-bound tomes, where Vernon waited, his lean frame poised by a window, his medical bag at his feet. His face was composed, his eyes steady, but Miss Marple noted a faint tightening of his jaw, like a St. Mary Mead vicar caught bending the truth. Crane opened his notebook, his voice brisk. "Dr. Vernon, you visited Reginald the night he died. Can you confirm the exact time?" Vernon nodded, his tone smooth. "I arrived at 8 post-dinner to discuss his heart condition. He was agitated but well. I left by 9, long before the poisoning." Miss Marple tilted her head, her needles pausing. "Your bag, doctor, might we inspect it?" Vernon hesitated, a flicker of unease crossing his face, then unlatched it, revealing vials, bandages, a stethoscope, no cyanide. Crane searched it thoroughly, finding only medical supplies, but Miss Marple's gaze lingered on a small leather case, its lock worn, tucked in a side pocket. "Do you ever use cyanide in your practice?" she asked, her voice mild. Vernon's smile was tight. "Never. It's far too dangerous." She nodded, his swift denial echoing as St. Mary Mead chemist's bravado before a confession. Crane shifted to Lionel, summoned next, his sketchbook clutched like a shield. "You argued with Reginald over debts," Crane said, his tone firm. Lionel shrugged, his eyes defiant. "I borrowed money, sure, but I repaid him with paintings. I was sketching in my room that night." His alibi, unverified, hung thin, and Miss Marple noted Clara's absence, her protective influence palpable. "Your mother confirmed this?" she asked, her voice soft. Lionel nodded, his fingers drumming, reminiscent of a St. Mary Mead youth hiding a prank's aftermath. Beatrice, joining them, shared that Reginald had planned to revise his will, favoring a veterans' charity. He mentioned it days before. "His death," she said, her voice low. Clara overheard and was furious. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed, the missing codicil a growing thread in her tapestry. She asked Vernon about Reginald's brandy, and he recalled seeing the decanter in the study, untouched. "He poured it himself," Vernon said, his tone neutral but his eyes watchful. Miss Marple nodded, her mind on the lavender scent and the green silk thread, both pointing to Clara. Lunch in the dining room was strained, the clink of cutlery loud against the silence. Clara, composed again, wore a navy gown, her lavender perfume wafting as she sliced her chicken. Arthur picked at his meal, his spectacles fogging while Lionel sketched, his eyes flicking to his mother. Miss Marple watched, her knitting steady, noting Clara's calm as a veneer, like a St. Mary Mead widow's poise before a revelation. She asked, her tone casual, "Mrs. Langley, did you ever discuss the passage with Reginald?" Clara's smile was sharp. "I had no patience for his whims," she said, her voice edged. Miss Marple nodded, the pearl in her pocket a silent clue. Its match to Clara's necklace undeniable. After lunch, Miss Marple strolled the grounds, pausing by the stables where the passage's exit lay hidden. The ivy was undisturbed, but a faint scuff in the dirt, a woman's shoe, like the hearth's print, caught her eye. She returned to the study with Crane, who reported no new prints in the passage. "It's a dead end," he said, but Miss Marple disagreed, her mind on Clara's gown and Vernon's locked case. "The truth hides in plain sight," she said, recalling a St. Mary Mead case where a doctor's alibi had crumbled under scrutiny. Crane questioned Gibbs again, who swore ignorance of the passage, but his clasped hands betrayed unease. Miss Marple asked about Vernon's visits, and Gibbs admitted seeing him leave late, his bag always in hand. He was discreet, Gibbs said, his eyes avoiding hers. She nodded, her knitting resumed, her thoughts on Vernon's calm and Clara's. Scent. Dinner brought more tension, with Clara pressing Arthur to sell the hall, her voice sharp. "It's a burden," she said, while Arthur mumbled about its history. Miss Marple watched, her needles clicking, the pearl and thread weaving into her. Deductions. Vernon's alibi held, but Wyvern Hall's secrets were stirring, and Miss Marple was closing in. Chapter 8. The Codicil's Trail. The afternoon sun bathed Wyvern Hall in a golden haze, its light filtering through the drawing room's windows where Miss Jane Marple sat, her knitting bag beside her, a half-finished scarf in her lap. The hidden passage had explained the locked study, but the cyanide's delivery and the missing codicil to Reginald's will remained elusive, like a St. Mary Mead mystery where a lost letter had held the key to a theft. Clara Langley's lavender scent, the green silk thread, the pearl from her necklace. These clues pointed to her, yet Miss Marple knew haste could unravel the truth. Villages, like families, revealed their secrets slowly, and she was patient. Beatrice joined her, her face weary, mentioning Crane's latest find, the codicil discovered in Clara's room, hidden in a jewelry box. "It leaves half the estate to a veterans' charity," Beatrice said, her voice low, reducing Arthur's share. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed, the codicil's absence now explained, but its hiding place raised questions. And St. Mary Mead, a hidden document, had betrayed a widow's greed, and she suspected Clara's motives ran deep. Was Clara aware of its terms? She asked, her tone mild. Beatrice nodded. She overheard Reginald discuss it. She was livid, saying Lionel deserved more. Crane arrived, his notebook bulging, and summoned Clara to the library for questioning. Miss Marple followed, her knitting bag a steady companion, noting the room's somber air, its shelves a silent witness to the unfolding drama. Clara stood by a window, her navy gown elegant, her lavender perfume wafting as she faced Crane. "I found the codicil on Reginald's desk," she said, her voice steady but her eyes guarded, like a St. Mary Mead matron hiding a scandal. "I kept it to protect Lionel's future." Crane pressed her, noting her fingerprints on the document alongside Reginald's. "Why hide it?" he asked, his tone sharp. Clara's smile was brittle. "I panicked, Inspector. Arthur's inheritance seemed unfair." Miss Marple watched, her needles idle, noting Clara's composure, like a St. Mary Mead widow's charm before a confession. "And the passage?" she asked, her voice soft. "Did you know of it?" Clara's eyes flashed. I told you it was Reginald's obsession, not mine. Her denial was swift, but Miss Marple recalled the green thread and the hearth's footprint, both tied to Clara's presence. Crane excused Clara, and Miss Marple suggested testing the codicil for other prints, her mind on the passage's dust. She wandered to the village pub, the Wyvern's Rest, where locals gathered, their voices a low hum. The barman, Mr. Tate, shared gossip over a cup of tea. Clara's late husband, a chemist, had access to cyanide, a detail that lingered in Miss Marple's thoughts. She's a proud one, Tate said, always in lavender, always up the hall. Miss Marple nodded, recalling a St. Mary Mead chemist's widow whose supplies had fueled a crime. Back at the hall, lunch was a quiet affair, with Arthur withdrawn, Lionel sketching and Clara deflecting questions with practiced ease. Miss Marple asked Beatrice about Clara's husband, and Beatrice confirmed he'd been a pharmacist, dying years ago. Clara rarely speaks of him, she said, her voice low. Miss Marple's needles clicked, her mind on cyanide's accessibility, the pearl in her pocket a silent link to Clara's necklace. She strolled the grounds, pausing by the moat, its surface still, and noted a faint lavender trace near the stable's exit, as if Clara had lingered there. Crane reported the codicil's prints, only Clara's and Reginald's, but the green. Threads matched to her gown strengthened the case. It's not enough for an arrest, he said, his brow furrowed. Miss Marple suggested watching Clara's movements, her mind on a St. Mary Mead case where a widow's habits had betrayed her. Dinner brought more tension, with Lionel accusing Arthur of hiding the codicil, his voice bitter. You wanted it all, he said, while Clara defended him, her lavender scent strong. Miss Marple watched, her knitting steady, the pearl and thread, anchoring her deductions as the evening closed. Miss Marple joined Beatrice by the fire, sharing a St. Mary Mead tale of a hidden well. People guard what they fear to lose, she said, her voice soft. Beatrice sighed, her hands twisting a handkerchief. Miss Marple's needles clicked, her mind on Clara's jewelry box and the codicil's terms. Wyvern Hall's secrets were surfacing, and Miss Marple, with her quiet vigilance, was ready to trace their trail. Chapter 9. A trackless set. The morning air was crisp as Miss Jane Marple sat in Wyvern Hall's conservatory, her knitting bag beside her, the scent of damp earth and orchids mingling with her thoughts. The codicil's discovery in Clara's room had tightened the net around her, but the cyanide's delivery and her precise role in Reginald's death remained elusive. The green thread, the lavender scent, the pearl from her necklace, these clues painted a picture, yet Miss Marple knew. A premature tug had unraveled the truth. In St. Mary Mead, a staged confrontation had once forced a thief's confession, and she sensed a similar tactic might crack Wyvern Hall's enigma. She joined Beatrice in the drawing room, where Crane awaited, his face lined with the case's weight. Miss Marple proposed a plan, announced the codicil's discovery to the family, claiming new evidence tied to the passage, and watched their reactions. People betray themselves under pressure, she said, her voice soft, recalling a St. Mary Mead scandal where a public accusation had exposed a liar. Crane agreed, arranging a gathering after lunch, and Miss Marple suggested placing the brandy decanter in the study, untouched, to test for tampering. A baited hook, she said, her eyes gleaming, catches the wary fish. The family assembled in the dining room, the tension palpable as Gibbs served a light meal of poached salmon. Clara sat erect, her lavender perfume wafting, her eyes sharp. Arthur fidgeted, his spectacles slipping, while Lionel sketched, his restlessness a mirror to his mother's calm. Dr. Vernon, present at Beatrice's insistence, spoke of the village's unease, his charm of thin veil. Miss Marple watched, her knitting steady, noting Clara's glance at Arthur, like a St. Mary Mead matron eyeing a rival. She asked, her tone casual, "Mrs. Langley, did you ever handle the decanter?" Clara's smile was cool. "Never. Reginald was particular about his brandy." After lunch, Crane gathered the family in the library. The codicil on the table, its terms laid bare, half the estate to a veterans' charity, slashing Arthur's inheritance. "We found this in Mrs. Langley's room," Crane said, his voice firm, and evidence in the passage points to its use the night of the murder. Clara paled, her hands clenching, while Lionel stormed out, his sketchbook abandoned. Arthur, surprisingly, spoke up, his voice steady. "I'll honor the codicil," he said, his eyes on Beatrice. "Father wanted it." Miss Marple noted Clara's silence, her composure cracking, like a St. Mary Mead widow's facade before truth emerged. That evening, Miss Marple lingered near the study, her knitting bag a pretext as she watched the hall. Clara, claiming a headache, slipped from her room, her navy gown blending with the shadows. Miss Marple followed, her steps silent, and saw Clara enter the study, her movements swift. Peering through a crack in the door, she watched Clara approach the decanter, producing a small vial from her sleeve and pouring its contents inside. Miss Marple's heart quickened, but she remained still, signaling Crane, who had been stationed nearby. He entered, seizing the decanter before Clara could retreat, his voice sharp. "Mrs. Langley, what's this?" Clara froze, her eyes wide, then claimed she was checking the decanter for dust. Crane, unconvinced, ordered the liquid tested, and Miss Marple stepped forward, her voice gentle. "A second attempt, Mrs. Langley?" Clara's composure shattered, her hands trembling, but she denied everything, her lavender scent strong. The decanter's contents, tested by a constable, revealed cyanide, and Crane detained Clara for questioning, her protests echoing down the hall. Dinner was somber, with Lionel shaken, Arthur withdrawn, and Beatrice tearful. Miss Marple joined, them her knitting a steady rhythm, her mind on Clara's desperation. She meant to protect her son, she said to Beatrice, recalling a St. Mary Mead mother whose love had led to ruin. Crane reported Clara's refusal to confess, but the vial's residue matched the study's cyanide. Miss Marple suggested searching Clara's room for more evidence, her mind on the pearl and the green thread, both tied to the passage dot. As the evening closed, Miss Marple walked the grounds, pausing by the moat, its surface reflecting the stars. The trap had sprung, but Clara's full story remained untold, her motives a tangle of love and greed. In St. Mary Mead, a staged revelation had unmasked a thief, and Wyvern Hall's trap had exposed a killer. Miss Marple's needles clicked, her thoughts on the codicil and the passage's dust, the truth now within reach. Chapter 10. The confession. The dawn broke over Willoughby Vale, painting Wyvern Hall's gables in soft pinks as Miss Jane Marple sat by her guest room window, her knitting bag open, a scarf nearly complete. Clara Langley's attempt to poison the decanter had confirmed her role in Reginald's death, but the full scope of her actions, how she'd accessed the cyanide, navigated the passage, and locked the study remained a tapestry half-woven. In St. Mary Mead, a widow's tearful confession had once closed a case, and Miss Marple sensed Clara's resolve was crumbling under Crane's questioning. She joined Beatrice in the morning room, where the air was heavy with grief. Beatrice, her hands trembling, spoke of Clara's detention, her voice low. "I never imagined her capable," she said, "but Lionel's devastated." Miss Marple patted her arm, her tone soothing. "Love can twist us," she said, recalling a St. Mary Mead mother whose devotion had masked malice. Crane arrived, his face drawn, reporting that Clara had requested to speak, her defiance waning. "She's ready to talk," he said, "but once you there, Miss Marple." They moved to the library, where Clara sat, her navy gown creased, her lavender perfume faint, her face pale but composed. Crane began, his notebook open, his voice firm. Mrs. Langley, the decanter cyanide. Matches the studies. Explain yourself. Clara's eyes met Miss Marple's, a flicker of resignation in them, and she sighed, her hands folding in her lap. I did it, she said, her voice steady at first, then breaking. I poisoned Reginald to secure Lionel's future. She recounted her plan. Reginald's codicil, favoring charity, threatened Lionel's inheritance, already strained by his debts. Arthur would squander the estate, she said, her voice bitter. Lionel deserved better. Her late husband, a chemist, had left cyanide in an old storage box, which she'd kept, its danger a dormant weapon. On the night of the murder, she'd used the hidden passage, known to her from Reginald's searches, entering the study unseen. She'd laced the brandy glass with cyanide, locked the door from inside, and left the key. Exiting through the passage to the stables, Miss Marple listened, her needles idle, noting Clara's precision, like a St. Mary Mead widow's calculated. Theft. And the lavender? She asked, her voice soft. Clara's smile was wry. My perfume, a habit. I didn't think it would linger. The green thread, she admitted, caught on a passage nail, and the pearl fell from her loose clasp. Unnoticed. I meant to retrieve the codicil, she said, but panicked when I found it. Her second attempt, poisoning the decanter, was a desperate bid to deflect suspicion. Believing Arthur might drink next. Lionel, summoned, stood horrified, his sketchbook falling. Mother, you didn't, he whispered, his voice breaking. Clara's. Eyes softened, her hands reaching for him. I did it for you, she said, but he recoiled, fleeing the room. Miss Marple watched, her heart heavy, recalling a St. Mary Mead son's shame at his mother's crime. Crane arrested Clara, her confession recorded, her composure fracturing as she was led away, her lavender scent trailing. Lunch was a silent affair, with Arthur staring at his plate, Beatrice tearful, and Vernon offering quiet support. Miss Marple joined them, her knitting a steady rhythm, her mind on Clara's love, twisted into murder. She thought it was justice, she said to Beatrice, her voice soft. Crane reported the cyanide source confirmed, traced to Clara's husband's drawers, and the passage's footprints matched her shoes. It's airtight, he said, thanking Miss Marple for her trap. Miss Marple strolled the grounds, pausing by the church, where Reverend Holt spoke of redemption. Clara's heart was heavy, he said, and Miss Marple nodded, her thoughts on forgiveness. In St. Mary Mead, a confession had healed a village, and she hoped Willoughby Vale might mend. Her needles clicked, the pearl and thread now relics of a solved case, the truth laid bare by Clara's own words. Chapter 11. The village reacts. The midday sun warmed Willoughby Vale, its light glinting off the village green as Miss Jane Marple walked its cobblestone lanes, her knitting bag swinging gently. Clara Langley's confession had closed the case of Reginald's murder, but the ripples of her crime spread through the village like gossip at a St. Mary Mead fete. The hidden passage, the poisoned brandy, the codicil's greed-driven theft, these truths had shocked the hall's residents, and Miss Marple knew villages thrived on such tales, weaving them into their lore. She aimed to gauge the mood, steps taking her to familiar haunts. At the Willow Leaf tea shop, Elsie, the waitress, greeted her with wide eyes, her apron dusted with flour. Miss Marple, is it true? Mrs. Langley poisoned the colonel? She asked, pouring tea. Miss Marple nodded, her tone mild, sharing only what Crane had released. Clara's confession, driven by love for Lionel. Elsie gasped, her hands trembling. She was so elegant, always in lavender. Who'd have thought? Miss Marple smiled, sipping her Earl Grey, recalling a St. Mary Mead baker whose charm had hidden a theft. Hearts are complex, she said, her voice soft, encouraging Elsie's. Chatter. The tea shop buzzed with locals, their voices a mix of shock and vindication. At a nearby table, two women debated Claire's motives, one calling her a devoted mother, the other a scheming widow. Miss Marple listened, her needles clicking, noting how truth mingled with exaggeration, like a St. Mary Mead scandal over a missing heirloom. She asked Elsie about Lionel, and the girl frowned. He's been by the river sketching, but quieter now. Folks say he's ashamed. Miss Marple nodded, her mind on a St. Mary Mead youth whose mother's crime had shadowed him. Next, she visited the post office where Mrs. Penny sorted letters, her eyes gleaming with curiosity. Miss Marple, you've solved another one, she said, leaning over the counter. Clara Langley, a murderess. And that passage straight out of a novel. Miss Marple smiled, buying a stamp, her tone deflecting praise. Inspector Crane did the work, she said, but Mrs. Penny pressed for details. Sharing village talk, Clara's chemist husband, her lavender scent, Lionel's debts. She fooled us all, Mrs. Penny said, but you saw through her. Miss Marple nodded, her knitting bag a steady weight, recalling a St. Mary Mead postmistress whose gossip had cracked a case. Back at Wyvern Hall, Beatrice greeted her, her face lighter despite the grief. The village is talking, she said, pouring tea in the drawing room. They're planning a fete to lift spirits. Miss Marple nodded, suggesting Beatrice host it, a gesture to heal the hall's wounds. Beatrice agreed, vowing to preserve Wyvern Hall as a community trust, honoring Reginald's charity wish. Arthur, joining them, supported her, his voice steadier. I'll catalog the hall's history, he said, to keep its stories alive. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed, noting his resolve, like a St. Mary Mead heir reclaiming his legacy. Crane arrived, tying up loose ends. The footprint matched Clara's shoes, the green thread her gown, the pearl her necklace. It's a solid case, he said, thanking Miss Marple. She deflected, her needles clicking, sharing a St. Mary Mead tale of a scandal healed by truth. Villages mend, she said, her voice soft. Dinner was quieter, with Lionel absent, sketching by the river, and Vernon offering medical advice. To Beatrice, Miss Marple watched, her knitting steady, noting the hall's slow healing. Like a St. Mary Mead parish after a storm, she strolled to the church, where Reverend Holt spoke of forgiveness, his words a balm. Clara's path is hers, he said, but the village can heal. Miss Marple nodded, her thoughts on redemption, her knitting a rhythm of closure. Wyvern Hall's truth had stirred Willoughby Vale, but its people, like St. Mary Mead's, would weave it into their strength, and Miss Marple, with her quiet insight, had guided them there. Chapter 12. Loose Ends. The late afternoon sun bathed Wyvern Hall in a golden glow, its rays filtering through the mullioned windows of the drawing room where Miss Jane Marple sat, her knitting bag open beside her. A nearly completed scarf spilled. Across her lap, its soft wool a testament to the hours spent unraveling the mystery of Sir Reginald Langley's murder. Clara Langley's confession had laid bare the truth cyanide in the brandy, a hidden passage, a codicil concealed in greed butt. The case's edges demanded final stitching, much like a St. Mary Mead quilt requiring its last careful seams. The hall was quieter now, its secrets exposed, and Miss Marple sensed the family's tentative steps toward healing, though the scars of betrayal lingered. Her task was to ensure no threads dangled, her mind as precise as the needles clicking. In her hands, Lady Beatrice Langley joined her silver hair catching the light, her face softened by a relief that had been absent days before. She poured tea from a porcelain pot, the steam curling like the mist that had cloaked Willoughby Vale's lanes at dawn. Jane, the hall feels lighter, Beatrice said, her voice warm but tinged with sorrow. Clara's arrest, though, it's left us all shaken. Miss Marple nodded, her eyes gentle but alert, recalling a St. Mary Mead widow, whose confession had mended a village's wounds. "Truth, however painful, sets us free," she said, sipping her Earl Grey, its bergamot, notes grounding her thoughts. "But the details must be settled, my dear, to let the heart rest." Beatrice mentioned Inspector Crane's final report, delivered that morning. "He's tied every knot," she said, her hand smoothing her napkin. "The footprint, the thread, the cyanide, it all points to Clara." Miss Marple tilted her head, her needles pausing. "And Lionel's alibi?" she asked, her tone mild but probing. Beatrice hesitated, then shared that Crane had verified Lionel's paintings, dated the night of the murder, found in his room. "He's no killer," she said, her voice low. "Just a son caught in his mother's shadow?" Miss Marple nodded, her mind flashing to a St. Mary Mead youth whose sketches had cleared him of theft. Their dates a silent witness to his innocence. Crane arrived, his notebook tucked under his arm, his face weary but satisfied. He settled into an armchair, accepting Beatrice's offer of tea, and laid out the case's resolution. "The footprint by the hearth," he said, "matched Clara's shoes, exactly small, pointed, like the one in the passage. The green silk thread caught on a nail in the hidden tunnel was confirmed as a fragment of Clara's emerald gown worn the night of the murder. The pearl, which Miss Marple had found in the study's rug and kept in her pocket, was a perfect match to Clara's necklace, its loose clasp shedding beads unnoticed. And the cyanide," Crane continued, "traced to her late husband's chemical stores kept in a locked box in her room." Miss Marple's eyes gleamed, each clue a stitch in the case's fabric. Like a St. Mary Mead ledger closing a scandal's accounts, she asked about Dr. Hugh Vernon's late visits, which had stirred village gossip. Crane shook his head, his tone firm, innocent. He was treating Reginald's heart condition, nothing more. His bag held only medical supplies, no cyanide, no secrets. Miss Marple nodded, though her mind lingered on Vernon's locked leather case, its worn clasp a faint question mark. No evidence implicated him, and she let the thought fade, recalling a St. Mary Mead doctor whose routine had been just as mundane. "And the codicil?" she asked, her voice soft. Crane confirmed its authenticity, its terms splitting the estate between Arthur and the Veterans Charity, as Reginald had intended. "Arthur's agreed to honor it," he said, glancing at Beatrice, who smiled faintly, her hands relaxing. Miss Marple's needles resumed their rhythm steady as she probed further. "The passage's dust, any other traces?" Crane nodded, detailing how the footprints were Clara's alone, their size and tread unmistakable. The passage's exit near the stables showed no other signs of use, its ivy undisturbed save for Clara's careful steps. "She was meticulous," Crane said, "but the lavender gave her away." Miss Marple smiled, the scent a signature she'd noted from the start, like a St. Mary Mead widow's perfume betraying her presence at a crime. "People leave traces," she said, her voice soft, "even when they think they've hidden them." Beatrice excused herself to check on lunch, and Miss Marple joined Crane in the study, now unsealed, its air lighter without the weight of suspicion. The hearth, once a portal to the passage, stood silent, its bricks bearing the faint scars of their discovery. Miss Marple traced the lever's outline, her fingers brushing the worn brick, and mused on human nature, greed, and love, so often entwined. In St. Mary Mead, a hidden cache behind a fireplace had closed a theft, and Wyvern Hall's passage had done the same, its dust a witness to Clara's guilt. She examined the desk, its papers now organized, and noted the brandy decanter. Cleaned and returned, a relic of the trap that had ensnared Clara. Crane shared that Lionel's paintings, vibrant landscapes of Willoughby Vale's river, had been authenticated by a village artist, their timestamps clearing him. "He's struggling," Crane said, "but he's no murderer." Miss Marple nodded, her thoughts on Lionel's restless energy, so like a St. Mary Mead youth whose art had been his salvation. She asked about Gibbs, the butler, whose unease had caught her eye. Nervous, but clean, Crane said. He knew nothing of the passage, and his keys accounted for the study's lock. Miss Marple's needles clicked, her mind satisfied. The case's knots tightening like a well-woven scarf. Lunch was served in the dining room, its long table set with linen and silver, the mood lighter despite the empty chairs Claire's in custody. Lionel by the river, sketching his grief. Arthur joined them, his spectacles polished, his voice steadier than before. I've spoken to Lionel, he said, cutting his roast. He'll paint murals for the hall to honor its history. Beatrice's eyes brightened, her hands clasping. A step toward healing, she said, and Miss Marple smiled, noting Arthur's resolve like a St. Mary Mead heir reclaiming his legacy after a scandal. Art mends, she said, her tone gentle, recalling a village painter whose work had soothed a fractured parish. Dr. Vernon arrived, invited by Beatrice. His lean frame relaxed as he spoke of the village's recovery. The fates planning is underway, he said, his charm a balm. It'll lift spirits. Miss Marple nodded, her knitting steady, suggesting Beatrice hosted at the hall. A gesture to unite Willoughby Vale. Communities heal through shared joy, she said, her voice soft, drawing on a St. Mary Mead fate that had mended a thief's wounds. Vernon agreed, offering to organize medical stalls, his role now clear of suspicion. After lunch, Miss Marple strolled to the village, her steps light on the cobblestone lanes. The green bustled with children, their laughter a counterpoint to the case's shadow. At the willow leaf tea shop, Elsie greeted her, her apron dusted with flour. Miss Marple, you've saved us, she said, pouring tea. Miss Marple deflected, sharing a St. Mary Mead tale of a scandal healed by truth. Villages are resilient, she said, her needles clicking, noting Elsie's bright eyes. A sign of Willoughby Vale's renewal. Mrs. Penny, at the post office, waved, her voice loud. A murder is caught. You're a marvel. Miss Marple smiled, buying a stamp, her tone modest. Inspector Crane's work, she said, though Mrs. Penny's grin suggested otherwise. At St. Cuthbert's Church. Miss Marple paused, the spire piercing the sky. Reverend Holt, tending the marigolds, spoke of forgiveness, his words a quiet echo of her thoughts. Clara's path is hers, he said, but the village will mend. Miss Marple nodded, her knitting bag a steady weight, recalling a saint. Mary Mead's sermon that had soothed a parish's pain. Truth is a balm, she said, her voice soft, her mind on the pearl, now evidence in Crane's files. Its sheen a relic of Clara's fall. Back at the hall, dinner was a quieter affair, the chandelier casting a warm glow over the table. Beatrice shared plans for the fete, her voice bright, while Arthur sketched restoration ideas, his pencil steady. Vernon spoke of community, his role now supportive, and Miss Marple watched, her knitting a rhythm of closure. The codicil, the passage, the lavender, the thread, all had led to Clara, her love for Lionel a tragic flaw. In St. Mary Mead, a resolved case had restored harmony, and Wyvern Hall was following suit, its wounds closing under Beatrice's care. As the evening deepened, Miss Marple lingered by the drawing-room fire, her scarf complete, folded neatly in. Her bag. She reflected on the case, its clues a tapestry of human frailty, greed, love, desperation. The hall's harmony was returning, its family and village knitting together, like St. Mary Mead after a storm. She slipped the knitting bag over her arm, her thoughts on Willoughby Vale's strength, its people resilient in the face of truth. The loose ends were tied, the case closed, and Miss Marple, with her quiet insight, had woven its resolution, ready for the journey home. Chapter 13. Reflections by the fire. The fire crackled in the drawing room of Wyvern Hall. its golden glow casting dancing shadows across the damask walls and the polished oak floor. Miss Jane Marple sat in a high-backed armchair, her knitting bag open beside her, a completed scarf folded neatly within, its soft wool a testament to the hours spent unraveling the mystery of Sir Reginald Langley's murder. The case was closed. Clara Langley's confession, a final stitch in the tapestry of true cyanide in the brandy, a hidden passage, a codicil driven by greed, but Miss Marple's habit was to reflect, to sift through the human frailties that had shaped the crime. In St. Mary Mead, evenings by the hearth had clarified the motives behind a theft or a betrayal, and Wyvern Hall's lessons, she sensed, were worth pondering, their weight as tangible as the knitting needles resting in her lap. The room was warm, its air scented with beeswax and the faint smokiness of burning logs, a contrast to the autumn chill pressing against the windows. Outside, Willoughby Vale lay under a starlit sky, its cobblestone lanes and thatched cottages quiet, save for the distant hum of preparations for the village fete, a sign of healing after the storm of Clara's crime. Miss Marple's eyes, sharp behind her spectacles, traced the fire's flicker, her mind weaving through the case's threads, the smudged footprint by the study's hearth, the green silk thread from Clara's gown, the pearl from her necklace, the lavender scent that had betrayed her. Each clue had led to the truth, not through force, but through the quiet observation she had honed in St. Mary Mead, where a villager's glance could reveal more than a constable's notebook. Lady Beatrice Langley entered, her silver hair glowing in the firelight, her navy dress simple yet elegant, a reflection of her resilience. She carried a tray with a silver teapot and 2 porcelain cups, their delicate rose pattern catching the light. "Jane, you're still awake," she said, her voice warm but tinged with the fatigue of recent days. "I thought cocoa might suit just better tonight." She set the tray on a low table, pouring the rich, chocolatey liquid, its steam curling like a memory of the morning mist. Miss Marple smiled, accepting a cup, her fingers warmed by its heat. "You're too kind, Beatrice," she said, her tone gentle. "A fire and cocoa are perfect for reflection." Beatrice settled into the chair opposite, her hands cradling her cup, her eyes searching Miss Marple's face. "You've saved us, Jane," she said, her voice earnest. "Wyvern Hall was unraveling, and you brought us peace." Miss Marple shook her head, her expression modest, her needles idle in her lap. "I merely listened, my dear," she said, deflecting the praise with the ease of the St. Mary Mead spinster accustomed to village accolades. The truth was there in the hall's walls and the hearts within it. Beatrice's smile was faint, but her eyes held gratitude, like those of a St. Mary Mead widow whose burdens had been lifted by a neighbor's insight. Miss Marple sipped her cocoa, its sweetness grounding her thoughts, and shared a tale from St. Mary Mead, her voice soft but deliberate, as if weaving a parable. "There was a vicar's wife once," she began, "who thought to protect her family by hiding a theft. She took a silver chalice, believing its sale would save her son's debts. That the village knew through whispers, glances, a misplaced glove. When the truth came, it hurt, but it healed." Beatrice listened, her hands tightening on her cup, her face reflecting the parallel to Clara's desperate act. "Clara thought she was saving Lionel," Beatrice said, her voice low. "But she lost him in the end." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes on the fire, its flames a mirror to her thoughts. "Love can distort," she said, her tone gentle but firm. Clara's heart was set on Lionel's future, but greed twisted it, as it did in St. Mary Mead. The codicil, the passage, the cyanide, all were tools of her fear. She paused, her mind on the lavender scent that had clung to the study, a signature Clara could not erase, like a St. Mary Mead widow's perfume betraying her at a crime scene. "People guard what they fear to lose," she added, her voice a quiet thread, and in guarding they revealed themselves. Beatrice sighed, her hands twisting a handkerchief, its lace edges worn from worry. How did you know, Jane? The passage, the pearl, how did you see what we missed? Miss Marple chuckled, her laughter soft, like the rustle of leaves outside. Old houses are like old friends, she said, her eyes twinkling. They creak with secrets if you listen. The hearth's footprint was too precise, the lavender too persistent. And the pearl well necklaces betray their owners, as a St. Mary Mead brooch once did. Beatrice marveled, her face softening, and Miss Marple's needles stirred, beginning. A new scarf, its first stitches a rhythm of renewal. Arthur Langley entered, his spectacles polished, his tweed jacket less rumpled than before, a sign of newfound resolve. Miss Marple, he said, his voice steadier, I owe you thanks. The hall's future is clearer now. He settled on a sofa, his hands clasped, his eyes meeting hers with a gratitude that reminded her of a St. Mary Mead heir, reclaiming his legacy after a scandal. I've spoken to Lionel, he continued, his tone earnest. He'll paint murals for the hall to honor its history, and will uphold Father's charity bequest. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed, noting his strength like a village youth, stepping into responsibility. A fine choice, she said, her voice warm. Families heal through shared purpose as St. Mary Mead's did after a storm. Arthur nodded, his face brightening, and shared plans to restore the hall, cataloging its archives to preserve its stories. Lionel's talent will bring it alive, he said, his voice firm. Miss Marple smiled, her needles clicking, her thoughts on Lionel's restless energy now channeled into art, much like a St. Mary Mead painter whose work had soothed a fractured parish. Art is a bridge, she said, her tone gentle, and Wyvern Hall will stand stronger for it. Beatrice's eyes misted, her hands relaxing, and Miss Marple sensed the family's wounds closing. Their harmony a fragile but growing threat. Inspector Crane stopped by, his case closed, his notebook retired to his pocket. Miss Marple, you've my gratitude, he said, accepting a cup of cocoa from Beatrice, his face relaxed for the first time in days. Your trap caught Clara, and your eye saw the clues we overlooked. Miss Marple deflected, her tone modest. Your diligence, Inspector, made the case, she said, her eyes twinkling. I only pointed to the hearth and the pearl. Crane smiled, recognizing her humility, and she shared a St. Mary Mead story of a hidden will, its lesson in human nature universal. We guard our fears, she said, her voice soft, but truth sets us free. Beatrice spoke of the village. Fate, a community effort to move forward, its stalls and games already planned. We'll host it here, she said, her voice bright, to show the hall's heart. Miss Marple nodded, encouraging the gesture, her mind on a St. Mary Mead fate that had mended a theft's wounds. Villages thrive on shared joy, she said, her needles steady, her thoughts on Willoughby Vale's resilience. Its people knitting together like the stitches in her scarf. Crane agreed, mentioning the village's gratitude. There whispers now of Miss Marple's quiet genius, though she brushed it aside with a smile as the fire burned low. Miss Marple rose, strolling to the window where the moat reflected the stars. Its surface calm. The passage, the codicil, the lavender, the pearl all had led to Clara, her love for Lionel a tragic flaw, like a St. Mary Mead mother's greed for her son's future. She reflected on human nature, its capacity to heal or destroy, its secrets hidden in plain sight. In St. Mary Mead, fireside reflections had clarified a crime's heart, and Wyvern Hall's truth was no different greed had sparked the murder. But truth had restored balance. Beatrice joined her, offering a shawl against the night's chill. You've given us hope, Jane, she said, her voice soft. Miss Marple patted her hand, her touch warm. Hope grows where truth takes root, she said, recalling a St. Mary Mead parish healed by honesty. Arthur stood, promising to visit St. Mary Mead, his resolve a bridge between their worlds. Miss Marple smiled, her knitting bag slung over her arm, its new scarf a symbol of beginning's dot as the clock struck 10. Miss Marple returned to her chair, the fire's embers glowing. She reflected on Wyvern Hall's enigma, solved not by locks or poison, but by understanding the hearts within Clara's desperation. Lionel's shame, Arthur's growth, Beatrice's strength. The village's harmony was returning, its people resilient, like St. Mary Mead's after a scandal. Her needles rested, her thoughts on the fate, a celebration of renewal. Wyvern Hall's lessons would linger, and Miss Marple, with her quiet insight, had woven them into clarity, her heart light as she prepared for departure. Chapter 14. Departure from Willoughby Vale. The morning sun rose over Willoughby Vale, gilding the cobblestone lanes and thatched cottages with a soft, golden light that seemed to promise renewal. Miss Jane Marple walked slowly toward the village station, her suitcase light in her hand, her knitting bag slung over her arm, its familiar weight a comforting companion. The air was crisp, scented with dew and the faint sweetness of late roses, and the distant chime of St. Cuthbert's church bell echoed across the green, a gentle farewell to her time in this quiet corner of England. The case of Sir Reginald Langley's murder was solved. Clara Langley's confession, a final thread in a tapestry of greed, love, and betrayal, and Wyvern Hall was beginning to heal, its wounds soothed by truth. In St. Mary Mead, departures followed such resolutions, and Miss Marple felt the weight of Wyvern Hall's stories settling into her memory, like a tale told by firelight, ready to be carried home. Her steps were steady on the path, her sensible shoes tapping softly against the stones, each sound a rhythm of closure. The village was stirring, its people preparing for the upcoming fate, a celebration of resilience that would bind Willoughby Vale's heart anew. She paused at the green, where children chased a hoop, their laughter mingling with the clink of milk bottles on a delivery cart, a scene so like St. Mary Mead's that it warmed her heart. The statue of St. Cuthbert stood sentinel, its base ringed with marigolds, their petals bright against the weathered stone. Miss Marple smiled, her eyes tracing the village's outlines, its red-tiled post office, the willow-leaf tea-shops, steamed windows, the church spire piercing the sky, each a thread in the fabric of a community she had come to know. Her first stop was the post office, where Mrs. Penny, her bun as tight as her curiosity, sorted letters behind a counter cluttered with stamps and twine. Miss Marple, off so soon? She called, her spectacles glinting as she leaned forward, her voice loud with affection. You've left us a story to tell for years? Miss Marple smiled, her expression modest, as she purchased a postcard to send to St. Mary Mead, its image of Wyvern Hall's gables a fitting memento. The village solved its own riddle, Mrs. Penny, she said, her tone deflecting praise, though her eyes twinkled with the knowledge that her quiet observations had guided the way. Inspector Crane's diligence and your keen ears did the rest. Mrs. Penny laughed, her hands bustling as she handed over the postcard. Oh, we'll talk of you, miss. Clara Langley, a murderess, caught by your cleverness. And that hidden passage straight from a novel. She leaned closer, her voice dropping. Folks say Lionel's painting by the river, quiet-like, but healing. Miss Marple nodded, her knitting bag a steady weight, recalling a St. Mary Mead, postmistress whose gossip had cracked the theft's mystery. Time mends, she said, her voice soft, and art helps. She tucked the postcard away, promising to write, her heart warmed by Mrs. Penny's vigor, a sign of the village's enduring spirit. Next, she crossed the green to the willow leaf tea shop, its door jingling as she entered, the air thick with the scent of scones and brewing tea. Elsie, the young waitress, greeted her with a shy smile, her apron dusted with flour, her eyes wide with admiration. Miss Marple, you're leaving? she asked, her voice tinged with regret as she poured a cup of Earl Grey. Your wonder catching Mrs. Langley like that. Miss Marple settled at a window table, the view of the church spire framing her thoughts, and accepted a scone, its warmth a small gift. Inspector Crane's work, Elsie, she said, her tone gentle, deflecting the praise. I only noticed a footprint and a pearl. Elsie blushed, setting down a pot of jam, her hands trembling with excitement. But you saw it all, the lavender, the thread, the codicil. The village is buzzing, planning the fate to forget the sorrow. Miss Marple smiled, buttering her scone, her needles resting in her bag. She shared a St. Mary Mead tale of a fate that had healed a parish after a theft, its stalls and laughter a balm for fractured hearts. Villages are resilient, she said, her voice soft, noting Elsie's bright eyes, a mirror of Willoughby. Vale's recovery, your scones will draw them together, Elsie. The girl beamed, her shyness fading, and Miss Marple sipped her tea. The bergamot a quiet anchor for her reflections dot as she left the tea shop. The green was bustling villagers, setting up banners for the fete, their voices a cheerful hum. Two women by the statue discussed Clara's fall, one calling her a devoted mother gone astray, the other a scheming widow. Miss Marple listened, her knitting bag swinging, noting how truth mingled with embellishment, like a St. Mary Mead scandal over a missing heirloom. She paused by St. Cuthbert's church, where Reverend Holt tended the marigolds, his face serene. Miss Marple, he greeted, his voice warm. You've brought us peace. She nodded, her eyes on the spire, recalling a St. Mary Mead sermon that had soothed the village's pain. Truth is a balm, Reverend, she said, her voice soft. Your fate will do the rest. Holt spoke of forgiveness, his words a quiet echo of her thoughts. Clara's path is hers, but Willoughby Vale will mend, he said, his hands brushing soil from his cassock. Miss Marple agreed, her mind on the pearl, now evidence in Crane's files, its sheen a relic of Clara's guilt. Communities heal through shared stories, she said, her knitting bag a steady weight, its new scarf a symbol of beginnings. She promised to pray for the village, her heart light, and continued to the station, where the platform was quiet, the train's whistle a faint promise in the distance. Lady Beatrice Langley met her there, her navy coat elegant against the morning chill, her face radiant with gratitude. Jane, you've given us a future, she said, her embrace warm, her eyes misting. Wyvern Hall will stand thanks to you. Miss Marple patted her hand, her touch gentle, her tone modest. You and Arthur will keep its heart, she said, her eyes on the hall's distant gables, proud against the sky. Visit St. Mary Mead, Beatrice, and we'll share tea by my roses. Beatrice nodded, promising to come, her resolve a bridge between their worlds. Like a St. Mary Mead friendship forged in crisis. Arthur Langley arrived, his spectacles polished, his tweed jacket neat, a sign of his growing confidence. Miss Marple, he said, his voice firm, this is for you. He offered a small book, its leather cover embossed with Wyvern Hall's crest, a collection of its histories and sketches, including the priest's hole. To remember us, he said, his eyes meeting hers, his gratitude palpable, like a St. Mary Mead heir's gift after a scandal's end. Miss Marple accepted, her heart warmed, her fingers tracing the cover. I'll treasure it, Arthur, she said, her voice soft. Your hall stories are safe with you and Lionel's murals. The train's whistle sounded, its steam curling skyward, and Miss Marple boarded, settling by a window, her knitting bag open on the seat beside her. She began a new scarf, its first stitches tentative but sure, her needles clicking in a rhythm of closure. The platform receded, Beatrice and Arthur waving, their figures framed by the village's green, a scene she etched in the memory, as Willoughby Vale faded, its lanes and cottages blurring into the hills. She reflected on the case, her mind weaving its threads. The hidden passage, its dust disturbed by Clara's steps. The codicil, a spark of greed. The lavender scent, a signature of guilt. The pearl, a silent witness to betrayal. Clara's love for Lionel had twisted into murder, her desperation a mirror to a St. Mary Mead mother's theft for her son's sake. Yet the village's strength had prevailed, its people knitting together through truth, much like St. Mary Mead's resilience after a scandal. Beatrice's warmth, Arthur's resolve, Lionel's art, the fates' promise, all were signs of healing, a tapestry of hope woven from pain. Miss Marple's scarf grew, its wool soft under her fingers, each stitch a reflection of human nature's dual capacity to wound and mend. The train rattled through the countryside, its rhythm soothing, the fields beyond the window golden under the morning sun. She thought of Inspector Crane's diligence, the villagers' gossip, the hall's secrets. All had played their part, like a St. Mary Mead parish's collective wisdom. The pearl, the thread, the footprint, the lavender, each clue had been a step toward truth, not through force, but through the quiet patience she had honed in her village, where a glance or a whisper could unravel a mystery. Wyvern Hall's lesson was clear. Truth, however painful, set hearts free, and communities thrived on shared redemption. As the train neared St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple closed her knitting bag, the new scarf a promise of future puzzles. She smiled, her heart light, her thoughts on Willoughby Vale's fate, its laughter echoing in her memory. The enigma of Wyvern Hall was solved, its story complete, but life, she knew, would bring new riddles, each a chance to listen, to observe, to weave truth from the threads of human hearts. Her needles rested, her suitcase ready, and Miss Marple, with her quiet insight, was prepared for whatever lay ahead, her spirit as enduring as the villages she cherished.